Hey, this is Jamey with Stonemaier Games, and in today's Sunday sit-down video, I'm going to talk about what happens in a cooperative campaign game when you lose a scenario, and what I think is perhaps the best way to handle this situation, because different games handle it in different ways. The first category of games, and I'll list some examples in a second, but the first category has you repeat the scenario. So if you lose a cooperative campaign scenario, you have to repeat it, and you have to continue to do so until you beat that scenario, and then you can move on to the next scenario. A recent example of this that I played was Forgotten Waters. Forgotten Waters does something really clever with the scenarios in that it breaks up each scenario into two segments, kind of like you play through around 2 hours, and then if you're still winning, there's a clear break point, and then you continue to play another 2 hours, which I think is great, that you aren't required to sit down for 4 hours. You could break it up. But if you lose the scenario, you are supposed to go back and restart and start over from the beginning. We lost when we played the first scenario of Forgotten Waters. I think we lost actually technically 3 times. And each time we house ruled it a little bit and kept on going. And in hindsight, I realized why we did this. And I don't want to forget this. I want to give a quick shout out to the Going Analog podcast. I'll post a link below. When I was brainstorming this topic, I appeared on their podcast and made it kind of my topic for the podcast. Everyone on the podcast had their own topic. And so we discussed this. And one of the things they brought up was that in narratively driven games that still have plenty of mechanisms in them, but where narrative is very strong, as it is in Forgotten Waters, fantastic narrative, it can be pretty frustrating to be required by the game to repeat a scenario. Even though you might uncover different aspects of the narrative, there's going to be a lot of repeated content there, and it can be somewhat discouraging to have to go through it all again. And so this is one of the things that I've discovered about cooperative campaign scenarios, where if you lose, you have to start over from the beginning and repeat. And that was a slight frustration point in Forgotten Waters. The even bigger elephant in the room, of course, is Gloomhaven. In Gloomhaven, if you lose a scenario, you are supposed to repeat it until you get it right, until you beat it. I've heard Isaac talk about this, Isaac, the designer of Gloomhaven, and his perspective is, I think he used video games as an example. In video games, it can be very satisfying to attempt something difficult multiple times, and then when you finally beat it, you can feel really good and really triumphant about that. I totally get that. I think the challenge, though, is that video games are often much faster than tabletop games. And there is a digital version of Gloomhaven now. Maybe it plays much faster, but my experience with the tabletop version was that each scenario took around 90 minutes to 2 hours, sometimes even longer. I've heard from some people that it can go a little bit shorter. But for us, it was fairly long. And so to get to the end of a scenario and then have to repeat it was fairly frustrating. What would have made it a little bit better for me is if, and I'll talk about this idea of save points later, but if there were save points throughout each scenario, like if you are able to exit one certain room, if you needed to repeat that scenario, you would start over at the entrance to the room that you ended up in, as if you've beaten the previous room. I think that's a nice kind of hybrid method, and I'll talk about hybrid methods in a minute. But the key element here is that in games with that, even a game like Gloomhaven that is highly tactically driven, is a tactical combat game, if you are required to repeat the scenario, I think it hurts a bit if it is a long game opposed to a short game. Of course, Gloomhaven is the #1 game in the world, so I think plenty of people will disagree with this, but I am curious to hear from people who love Gloomhaven in particular. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about the requirement that you have to repeat the scenario instead of just moving forwards? And I'll talk about the moving forwards, the failing forwards method in a minute. So that's Gloomhaven. Seventh Continent is another one. Seventh Continent is this to the extreme. It's been a while since I played Seventh Continent. There may be save points in it. Feel free to correct me in the comments. But as I recall, each curse in the Seventh Continent could last for hours and hours. I've heard of some people playing the same curse for 12, 18 hours even, spread over multiple sessions. And I could see it being really, really discouraging and disheartening if you got up to hour 6 and then lost and died and had to start over from the very beginning. Please correct me in the comments about that, because I think there might be save points in it. But even so, because it is more of a narratively driven game, great mechanisms, but again, heavy narrative in Seventh Continent, that's what makes it shine. The idea that you have to repeat a lot of that narrative, even if you're exploring a different path, can be pretty discouraging. Now, some examples of faster games that I think this repeated scenario format works really well, because I would not put Forgotten Waters, Gloomhaven, and Seventh Continent in this format. If I were the designers of the games, I would not have you repeat scenarios that you fail. I would have you fail forwards, which is the method that I'll talk about in a minute. But for shorter games, like Harry Potter Hogwarts Battle, we lost plenty of scenarios when we played that. It's particularly like, I think, scenario 4, 5, maybe 6 we lost a few times. But it was fast enough. It was 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and we were able to, within the same session, play it multiple times and beat it, and that felt good. Same with a recent play. Megan and I played Shadow of Salvation, the Shards of Infinity cooperative expansion, and we lost 2 or 3 times to the first boss in this game, in this campaign, and we kept having to replay it, but it was so fast. Each session was like 30 minutes. So within the same sit-down session of it, we played 3 games against the same boss and eventually beat it and moved on, and that was fine. The other example of game that I haven't played is a game called The Crew. This is a new cooperative trick-taking game that I'm very curious about, but I haven't played it yet. And in The Crew, I've heard the games last like 5 or 10 minutes, and so what if you lose and have to replay it? It's just another 5 or 10 minutes, and it's probably pretty satisfying to be able to beat that at that level, only coming back around 5 or 10 minutes, rather than having to repeat a 2-hour scenario. So this is the repeat a failed scenario category. The next category are hybrid games, with another top-ranked game right at the top of the list, and that is Pandemic Legacy. In Pandemic Legacy, there are 12 months to play, and say you play January and you win, you move on to February. Say you play February and you lose a game of February, you have to replay it again. You might get a little boost, and I think that's great. I think that's great that at least something changes the next time you play, which I think is great about Pandemic Legacy. You get a little boost for the next time you play, and whether or not you win or lose after that second game in February, you're going to move on to March. So it's kind of a hybrid category. The game gives you a chance to go back and repeat it once. You're required to repeat that month once with a slight change to your abilities. And anything permanent that's happened to the board is still there. It's still permanent. That's what a legacy game is. But then you move on and advance if you don't win again. I think this hybrid method is pretty satisfying. Again, I think the length of the game matters to a certain extent. If you're repeating 2-hour scenarios multiple times, that can really add up. But again, Pandemic Legacy is usually around 60 minutes, so I think that fits very well. The one downside here that I found, especially in a campaign game, is the uncertainty of planning schedules with friends, basically, in terms of how long the campaign is going to take. So it's one thing to say, okay, guys, every week for the next 6 weeks, we're going to play 2 games of Pandemic Legacy, and then we know we're going to be finished by the end of the 6 weeks. But you can't do that with Pandemic Legacy because sometimes you're going to lose, and you don't know how many times you're going to lose and have to repeat. And so those 6 weeks could end up being 6 weeks, or they could be 10 weeks, or they could even be 12 weeks. It could be a huge variable amount. So I like that element of certainty going into a campaign game if you are trying to schedule it with friends. I know not everyone plays that way. You might play solo, you might play as a couple. There's more flexibility there. But if you're planning for friends, I think certainty in a campaign can be a huge asset. Another example in this category is of the hybrid category is Aeons and Legacy. And Ans and Legacy is very similar to Pandemic Legacy. If you lose the scenario, you have to repeat it, but then you continue on. And the cool thing that I think that Ans and Legacy does is that there are persistent elements that happen throughout the game depending on what happens in each scenario. Win or lose is kind of separate than whether or not you're winning or losing. For example, there are cards in the bad guy, the villain's deck, like kind of mini bosses, and if you don't defeat those mini bosses, they're going to stay in that deck and show up in future games. They'll also, if you defeat them, they'll go away permanently. And that happens whether or not you are losing the game. You can still have the satisfaction of taking care of a mini boss, which I think is really cool. Arkham Horror LCG is kind of a weird game in this hybrid category. I've only played one game of it, but I have heard that there are certain scenarios that you are required to repeat, while there are others that have you fail forwards, which is the final category that I'll talk about. So I think that kind of falls into the hybrid category. The other example is Time Stories. In Time Stories, especially the original version, it got a lot of flack for requiring players to run through a scenario, and then if you lose, and you almost do lose like the first or second times, you have to rerun through it again. And not a lot changes. It is fairly narratively driven, very narratively driven. But there are some things that are permanent. Like if you unlock parts of the map, those are permanent. Those typically don't go away. There are certain items that you carry over and remain permanent from run to run. So I do feel like there is a sense of progression to time stories, even though you are repeating some of the same content. And but I think it falls into this hybrid category pretty well. Now, my favorite category is the failing forwards category. Failing forwards often with consequences. This means that if you fail a scenario in a cooperative campaign game, you move on to the next scenario. Just like real life. If you have a bad day, you don't get to go back and repeat that day. You have to move on to the next day and deal with the consequences of what happened on that bad day. So I think it's a much more immersive, I'll say realistic. I don't think realistic is always better, but I think immersing you in the theme and making the consequences have weight is really important in many of these thematically driven games. I think this is the most thematic way to do it. Have you move forward and deal with the consequences of the poor choices that you made or the nasty things that happened to you in the scenario. So Journeys in Middle-earth is a new classic example of this. I've only played one scenario, and we won it, so I don't actually know what happens when you lose, but I have heard that it is a fail-forward concept, where if you lose a game of Journeys in Middle-earth, you still move on to the next scenario, but some things have changed based on what happened in that scenario that you lost. Imperial Assault is another one that's not quite cooperative because you are typically playing against a human player, a team against a human. But regardless of who wins, you are moving forward to the next scenario and dealing with those consequences. And oftentimes, similar to these other games that I mentioned, some of these other ones, you get a boost if you win. Sometimes you get a boost if you lose so that you can move forward. And the opposite can happen too. If you win, maybe something gets a little bit harder. The game can balance against the players that way as you move forward. Descent I haven't played, so I can't speak to that, but I have heard that the newest version has this fail-forward format. The one that I have played in this format, other than Journeys in Middle-earth, is Legacy of Dragonholt. In Legacy of Dragonholt, it's a very written, narrative, story-driven game. You have these storybooks that you open up for each scenario, and you read through them. There's a big map of the town that you also get to work with, but most of it is just reading. You're reading through the scenario. And the weight of the decisions you make in this game are truly incredible and memorable. I will never forget what happened in a certain scenario that I played. I won't spoil anything here, but a certain scenario that I played where we ran out of time and something really bad happened, and it would have been, I don't know, as bad as it was. I'm so glad that it happened and that we couldn't change it, because it meant that all the time that we had spent in that scenario actually meant something. Our decisions meant something, and we had to move forward with the knowledge of what we did wrong so we could do better in the next scenario, but also the emotional weight. It had an emotional weight that we were the cause of something bad, that we had the potential to stop something bad from happening, and we didn't. And that, I think, was so much more powerful than a narratively driven game where we could have just replayed it and retold the story in a different way. So I really like that Legacy of Dragonholt has this fail-forward element to it. A few others that I haven't played that I've heard have this are Gen 7, Too Many Bones, and Betrayal Legacy. Those are all the examples I have. Those are the three categories. Repeat a scenario if you fail, hybrid of repeat a certain number of times and then move forward, and then no repeats, just fail forwards and deal with the consequences. And for the reasons I've stated here, you can tell that I heavily prefer failing forward with consequences. I don't like the repetition of having to repeat anything in a game, particularly if there's a narrative element, but even if there's a tactical element. Repeating it to me just takes me out of the theme. It can make me kind of bored with the mechanisms almost. I want something fresh every time I play a cooperative campaign game. I don't want to have to repeat everything. But if you do feel that is the best choice for your game, I would recommend that you focus on snappy, quick scenarios. At most 60 minutes for the hybrid scenario, and at most like 30 to 45 minutes for a scenario that you're asking players to repeat multiple times. This is my opinion, though, and I'd love to hear your opinions about this, too, because I think these are some of the top games in the world that I mentioned on this list. So who am I to say that they would be better if they had a slightly different mechanism for repeating or not repeating a scenario? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on them in the comments. And if you have any other examples of games that fall into any of these categories and whether or not you like how they deal with losing in a cooperative campaign scenario-driven game, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks.